All right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hageman. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. All of you who have rated, reviewed the show, commented, let me know what you think, how it's helped you, how the advice has been applicable, has been transferable into your own program. Super helpful in directing future topics. For those of you who are new to the channel, I do 4 solo episodes a month, 2 guest episodes, and by the time that this is going out, we are going to have a new format coming to you bi-weekly, so corresponding on those opposite weeks where we don't have a guest coming on. And those videos are largely going to be educational, but they're going to be a little more digestible. So at this time, you may have already seen 1 or 2, and if you like those, definitely let me know. The whole idea with starting the podcast, this is a year into podcasting for me. The whole idea has been to provide value, not just to clients, not just to individuals who are, supporters, fans of what I'm doing, but also for you guys who might not know who I am, who are simply just seeking answers, seeking a tactical, just solutions to things that, you may at this point have been struggling with for years on end, which I find to be the case for a lot of people who come to me for coaching or even consultations. Individuals they're stuck. They're at a point where they're like, I don't know what else. It's not like I'm ignorant. It's not like I'm a beginner. I've been doing this for a long time. A lot of individuals I speak with, they have been at this for decades. And I was that person who, kind of boxed myself into this identity thinking, oh, I have thick skin. That's why I can't get my tie-ins to show, or I can't get like really deep lines in my lower body, or I just don't have that like very dry and hard look. I was that person. I very much believed that it was a, genetic maybe ceiling. And I can assure you, every time, it was also the case with muscle building, every time that, I've fallen I don't want to say victim, because I don't think it's victim, just fallen prey to the ignorance of, nothing's working. Digging your heels in and rerouting back to the basics has almost always unveiled a solution. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. We are talking about foods, 9 foods to be specific, that could be ruining your progress. That could be ruining your diet for that matter. And I'll say, like, now being, a little deeper into my fat loss phase, finally starting to see some transferable progress. The thing that made the biggest difference was getting back to the food reporting and tightening that shit up, making sure that, if I was eating out, that largely I was going in with the idea that, hey, like whatever I plan to log, I probably need to log a little bit more, probably need to track a little bit over to account for any discrepancies. We're going to go into that, and not necessarily my own personal fat loss phase, but we're going to go into 9 foods that could be the reason that you're in a fat loss phase, that you believe you're 100% adherent, that you believe that like you're like, I'm Corey, like it's not that I'm, being gluttonous. It's not that I'm sneaking food later in the day. It's not moving. I'm not seeing the progress, on the scale weight or my physique. And this has very much been the case for a lot of clients that I've encountered, I would say, in the last 3-6 months. They felt like they were doing everything right. They were counting, they were eating healthy foods. It's not like they were eating foods that had a lot of variability, but the scale, it was just not moving. And it's not to say that these foods are bad. It's not to say that you can't have these foods. It's not it at all. But having done this, having tracked macros for 15 years now, I started tracking when I was in high school. I still have instances where eyes surprise me, where I'm like, oh yeah, then this is why, you need to revert back to the basics when it comes to adherence, when it comes to data reporting, when it comes to accuracy behind food reporting. And in this video, we're going through nine sneaky culprits. Some you're probably be like, okay, yeah, that's low hanging fruit. But I'm gonna make it compelling, because even if you think, okay, well, I could just eliminate that from my diet, there are probably some of you who are still eating these foods or genuinely want to eat these foods. And I'll say, I had a client this week who, asked, we're going through a meal plan thing, and she's working on building her own meal plan, and in it, she's like, I want to have granola. And she's eating 1,400 calories. And I'm like, I love granola. Jordan's mom, she bought us 2 packs of the Purely Elizabeth. It's good. But here's the thing. There's a reason I don't buy granola. There's a reason I don't put it in my diet when I'm trying to lose fat. And it just simply comes down to, it's not exactly worth it. And spoiler, that's one of the foods we're going to get into today. But in this week, this client, she's not necessarily a beginner. She's someone I've worked with for almost a year now. We've been through multiple fat loss phases, we've been through builds. And she's like, I didn't know that this was something that would make adherence harder. I didn't put it together. And I think that's where a lot of the videos I've done recently, if you've been tuning into weekly episodes, you've seen I did the training terminology made simple, dieting terminology made simple. I've been doing videos that they are intended for all athletes, whether that be individuals who are just starting out, whether that be individuals who, are a little later in their career, but still are finding hey, I'm just not getting the progress that I think I should. I'm not getting what I'm hoping for. And frankly, I don't know what to do. So this video is about simply helping you recognize areas that maybe you could tighten up on, where you might unknowingly be adding in hundreds, yes, no exaggeration, hundreds of calories. But obviously for personalized advice, this is something that I can work with you on. No, I'm not a registered dietitian, but I can definitely give you some direction. I do offer coaching, and that does encompass nutrition. And even in the consultations, I've worked with people on a one-time basis where, frankly, it's been very focused on food behaviors and issues with adherence, and they've seen a lot of success. So if you're interested in that, info can be found in the description down below. But with that being said, let's dive right in. All right, so food number 1, rice. Rice, yes, white rice, brown rice, wild rice, whatever you want to categorize it as. From a coaching perspective, rice is a very low barrier to entry in terms of what you can put on a meal plan. And oftentimes, within the coaching space, you see this is on majority of meal plans. For the fact, and I think it's largely because even non-culinary folk, you can just dump it into a rice cooker, or you can buy a ready-to-eat pouch. You can heat it up in 90 seconds and then you're done. That makes it convenient, but it also makes it very easy to overeat because you have that batch prepped. No, that's not the primary argument here, but it does come with a cost. If you are a smaller female in a fat loss phase, which most of the women I work with, we're talking individuals in the 110 to 170 pound range who are looking to lose, anywhere from 5 to 20, 30 pounds. A lot of them, most of them are eating somewhere in a fat loss phase, eating between 100 to 150 grams of carbs. It's not to say that you should do this or you should take that and apply it, but when I look at rice as food selection in a fat loss phase, and we look at the amount of carbs that someone's going to ingest, it's not like you're going to get 100 grams of carbs or 150 grams of carbs directly from rice. There are going to be trace carbs throughout the day that you consume through vegetables, which you absolutely should, but also through other aspects of your diet, other components. So realistically, if we're talking about even 80 to 120 grams of carbs, if you're eating on the upper limit of what I broke down, you might only be allocating, 20 to 30 grams of carbs coming from rice. Now, in raw weight, which I do recommend weighing rice raw and accounting for it, if you are going into your food tracking app, I do recommend using that raw weight because there can be a discrepancy in water loss, but even though that water loss, depending on the cooking method, even though that might shift dramatically depending on how you cook it, you can very much dehydrate rice to a point, I guess not literally dehydrate it, but you can overcook it to a point where it loses a lot of that water. And essentially you're getting now an inconsistent or a variable weight, cooked versus uncooked, which ultimately can lead to under tracking the amount of carb content. So like the carb content of raw rice, and this applies to most foods, that in itself, you're going to find that that is going to stay the same regardless of how you go about cooking and preparing that meal. But really when it comes to rice, where I see the primary issue is that it's just not going to go very far. So yeah, like we can get into the weeds of like inconsistencies with cooking. And frankly, when I'm in contest prep, if I'm using rice or if I'm using cream of rice, I would prefer to go with already prepared versions. So versions in bags that are already portioned out and weighed out, and you just like have that already segmented. But even then, realistically, in the case of someone who's only eating, let's say 120 grams of carbs, if you're having 3 to 4 meals a day, realistically, you're not going to get that total amount of allowance strictly from rice. And even then, the amount that you're going to get is going to be very, very low volume. So in the case of we're talking about someone who's eating 120 grams of carbs per day, again, you have to consider the fact they're probably eating vegetables, they're probably having fruit, they're probably having some other form of carb source in their diet, not strictly rice, which I don't recommend that being your sole carb source. So once you get down into it, I mean, like maybe they're having rice 2 to 3 meals, it's not a high volume food. And for individuals who struggle with adherence, for individuals who struggle with feeling satisfied by their food, this is going to be something that, I mean, personally, what I've seen in my own diet, it's not something I necessarily enjoy. I don't like having, 2 or 3 bites per meal and then being done. But a lot of clients find this very dissatisfying. Another aspect to this is for the individuals who are going to be a little looser with their tracking, a little more flexible, who are potentially going to be eating out several times a week. You have to understand that the amount of rice that you're probably going to be served at a restaurant or even at like a fast food, so like Chipotle, Kava, Sweet Green, any of these places, you're probably not getting the amount that you want to get. You're probably getting double, if not triple that. And this is something that like a lot of people, they will be like, well, I'll just bring my scale and I'll just weigh it. But realistically, that's not going to be the case for most people listening to this. They're not going to want to just bring a scale with them in their purse every time they go out to eat. And frankly, it just comes back to the fact that like, if you're used to going to one of these restaurants, I mean, like if you're going to be ordering rice, you're probably going to either be hopefully saving it, but in some cases even wasting it because you're not able to take it with you and have it travel with you if, let's say, you're going back to work or going to the gym or whatever it might be. So globally, what I find is that like rice, I mean, given where it's at in the satiety index, given that it doesn't have a high fiber content, and yeah, people be like, well, brown rice, it's like, it's still not that high of fiber compared to the alternatives. That, in addition to its ability to be mistracked easily, overeaten easily, specifically in the restaurant or, non-prep setting, non-home cooked setting, but then also the fact that it just doesn't go very far. I think it's something that a lot of people, they feel like, okay, well, if I'm doing bodybuilding, if I'm trying to lose fat, I need to do this bodybuilding diet. I need to do what everyone else is doing. And it seems like everyone has this weird, fixation on having rice in their diet. When in reality, I think you would be better off, specifically for the individual who struggles with adherence, opting for something that is going to be a little more satiating and have a higher water and fiber content. Yeah, if you love rice and you don't mind the smaller servings, that's fine. But if you do prefer bigger, more satiating meals, this is something that very quickly, when someone comes to me and is like, I don't feel satisfied on 14 or 1500 calories, and I look at their meal plan and they have rice in 2 to 3 meals in these very like arbitrary, like very small serving sizes, I'm like, we can certainly find something better that leaves you feeling fuller and more satisfied. Now, on the flip side, if you were in a build, if you were in a phase where food is high and you're like, I need food that is easy to digest. I need it to hit a specific caloric amount per meal, and I need it to not feel like a chore having to consume it. I think rice is a great option, but deeper in a cut, I do think that for most people it can feel pretty unsatisfying, and specifically for the individual who's trying to build that skill of dieting and pushing themselves deeper into a fat loss phase, I don't think it's going to be your friend here. Now, food number 2, when it comes to high satiation, highly satiating, satisfying foods that keep you feeling fuller longer, potatoes are going to be my number 1 pick. This is because potatoes, they have a high percentage of water in them. Now, where they can mess you up, where they can really pose a dilemma for the individual who is not seeing the progress they want, is depending on whether or not you bake, boil, air fry, pan fry, whatever it might be, you're going to see that water content can shift dramatically. So just like we talked about with rice, this is something that initially that raw amount, that is static. The amount of carbs in, let's say, 150 grams of potatoes, regardless of if you roast them, broil them to the point that they are inedible, the carb amount is not changing. But you're going to see that the total volume, the net weight, can shift very dramatically. Now, this is what I think can lead to very big tracking errors if you only weigh your potatoes after they're cooked. And let me just pause and say, right now, in a fat loss phase, I am weighing them raw. Now, over the course of the last several months where I've kind of been like at a hold and maintenance, there's been times where I've asked Jordan, hey, can we weigh this raw? There's been other times where he's already started the prep and I'm like, yeah, fuck it, I'm just going to weigh it after the fact. Now, your decision making around whether or not you want to make the switch to weighing all your carbs and even proteins, raw versus cooked, this really comes down to, and in my opinion, I think it should come down to whether or not you are seeing the progress that you want, or whether or not there is turbulence, resistance, hindrance in your ability to drive fat loss in this case. Now, I don't think that it needs to be something that, you completely segregate how you cook all your foods, specifically in like a family or partnership setting. But I do think it's something in a fat loss phase or a contest prep setting, or in a phase where you're just like, hey, like I want to see if maybe I'm slightly off with what I'm reporting, with what I'm measuring. I think it could make a lot of sense to just trial this and even get an idea. Like if you cook food the same way every single time, like if you let's say parboil it, then pan fry it, or you air fry it, or whatever it might be, you can get a pretty good idea of how much water is lost. And just know that like, okay, if I'm not going to weigh it beforehand, but I cook it the same way every single time, then in my case, if I'm like, hey, I want 150 grams of, let's say, raw potatoes, but I know cooking it the way I cook it, it like condenses down and I lose, some degree of this to get that same carb amount. Well, then moving forward, if I'm going with that same numerical value, I can just follow that conversion and generally know that I'm probably getting the same amount of carbs each time. Now, if you don't want that ambiguity, which like I know some of y'all are probably like, yo, that stresses me out to even hear you talk about that, then just weigh it raw. There's your solution. But I do think potatoes are one that a lot of people, they will gravitate towards. And I myself, like I've pushed potatoes pretty heavily in our space to be like, hey, this is a great option for someone who is struggling with adherence. It's a great option if you're someone who feels like, rice is just not doing it for you. But in the instance that you are varying how you cook the potatoes very frequently, because like, trust me, there's so many recipes online and there's so many fit people online saying like, well, if you cook it this way, it tastes like, 10,000% better. It tastes like it's fried. It tastes like there's so much oil. Like, listen, just find a consistent cooking method that you're going to stick with and generally stick with that. And if you're going to vary the kind of cooking method that you have and it's going to potentially dehydrate it a little bit more or cause an increased amount of water loss that has not been the case in prior cooking methods, then just do a little bit of a reset and get an idea of how much water loss you would experience with that new cooking method. But personally, not that anyone asked, I love parboiling with a little bit of baking soda. That creates this like chemical reaction essentially where the outer layer is going to cook a little bit faster because now you have this release of pectin, I believe. So essentially parboiling, then a little bit of pan searing. You don't have to use heavy oil. If you're in the off season, definitely recommend, but you can use a little bit of spray butter, just go over them. But overall, I do think when it comes to like air fryers, oven methods, I think there's a high degree of variance depending on how you cook them, depending on how long you cook them, what temperature you cook them at. This is one of those things, like depending on how much trouble you're having with your fat loss phase. Like in the case where you're like, I'm not seeing progress, but I'm eating potatoes several times throughout the day and like almost pretty much every day throughout the week, which I do, that might be something you want to tighten up on because you don't want to have something that has a high variance in calories that you're also exposing yourself to at a high frequency. Food number 3, chia and flax seeds. Now, yes, they're super nutrient dense, omega-3s, fiber, but also very calorically dense and very tiny servings. Now, 1 tablespoon, that can be 70 to 80 calories, give or take. And that's like, if you're weighing it, 1 tablespoon is about 15 grams. Now, I will tell you, like, I was that person at one point where I'm like trying to find ways to get in more calories, kind of like unintentionally. And I'm talking like early days, like I'd be like, okay, well, like chia is healthy and it doesn't even taste that good. So it's like, here's some kind of, I don't know, weird mental gymnastics justifications that I've made. I see a lot of people do this. And I see a lot of people who claim that they can't get results. They're just like, I go through my day like just kind of sprinkling these throughout my meals because I know they're healthy, and Corey, I need omegas and I need fiber. It's like those little sprinkles can add hundreds of extra calories if you're not tracking them. And I can tell you, like I had a client recently who she's been in a fat loss phase, done like inherently pretty well. She came to me not seeing any progress, like super like I am weight loss resistant. And I told her, I'm like, okay, well, we need to get very clear about like your tracking and your food reporting. Put her on a meal plan over the course of 12 weeks. We've seen weight come down 10 pounds. And guys, that was through the holidays. So for her, I'm like, yo, that's a big fucking win right there. Like she should be really proud. Now, we're going through her meal plan because we're getting into the second half of this fat loss phase because she's not quite where she wants to be. And she's like, I think I want to switch up my breakfast and I want to go to more like this like smoothie acai bowl. And she like gave me a recipe, and the recipe has like 1 tablespoon of chia, 1 tablespoon of flax, 20 grams of like, I don't know, muesli or granola or something. And I'm like, yo, like you're a tiny, tiny woman. Like she's very petite. I'm like, you're not eating that much, like because of how small she is. She's eating like 1350, like almost 1400. And I'm like, I just don't think it's worth it considering the fact that you've had trouble with adherence, given that like these are not adding a ton. Like, sure, you can say that they add texture, I guess. I don't necessarily agree with that. And if you love fiber, like there are other ways that you can add like bulkier, low calorie fiber sources to your day, like to your meals. But realistically, when we're talking about something that is adding a bunch of calories, so by definition, calorically dense, that is not offering a lot of satiation for someone who is already struggling, stretching their budget, their caloric budget, that's just not something I'm going to recommend that you do. And this is really what I would encourage. And this is kind of the whole point of this video, is to give you the push that if you're struggling with feeling full, if you're struggling with adherence, if you're struggling with snacking later in the day or late at night, or just going off track because you feel like you're so fucking hungry, I want you to do an audit of all your meals. And I want you to score them. And it can be like very simple. It's like 1, 2, 3. Okay, like 1, this meal sucks. I would gladly trade this for something else. 3, this meal's perfect. No matter where my food is at, I want to eat similar compositions, maybe a little bit more, but like generally I enjoy it. Now, if you can find those meals that are 1s or even 2s, and you can like dissect them and be like, okay, this is a meal that contains like look at where the calories are coming from, and look at potentially, is there the option to take something out that is high calorie, or potentially add something more that is low calorie that will add to overall palatability and satiation. That's what I would recommend doing. But like for most people, I think chia seeds, I think flax seeds, like, yes, I know you need to get in your omegas. And like, this is something that a lot of people be like, well, that's not very healthy of you, Corey. Like, I thought you cared about health. It's like, I do, but generally for someone whose goal is fat loss, if they're struggling to be adherent, I'm going to look at the calorie bombs that are not doing a lot for them, which i.e. that's the whole point of this video. Number 4, red meat. Now, I am someone who enjoys red meat greatly. Like, that is generally one of my favorite protein sources. But where it becomes tricky is that cuts range from being very lean to marbled and very high fat. Now, for example, you can have something like eye of round that can be, 100, 150 calories, depending on how much you're eating. You can also have ribeye that can easily exceed 300 calories thanks to the higher fat content and higher marbling. Now, generally, what I see and where I see this like really bite people in the ass is that specifically for individuals, well, no, not just individuals who are counting macros, but specifically for individuals who are counting macros, they will log what is convenient for their macros that day, not necessarily what is specific to what they're eating. And listen, like I enjoy higher fat red meats, like I do, but it's something that I have to be very honest that even if you're preparing it yourself, there's a vast discrepancy in the amount of fat that is actually being purchased and being bought and packaged and then you take home with you to once then it's cooked, prepared, rested, and then once it's actually on your plate, the amount of fat that you're consuming, that is going to be variable even if you get the exact same order every time you go to, let's say, the supermarket. It's not going to be the same every single time. It's going to cook differently. It's going to be a different part of the animal. And that's where, again, this comes back to if you're eating it in high frequency, we just have to own the fact that that high variance could be ultimately working against you in terms of your deficit. And even when we talk about like labels such as like 93.7, 96.4, that refers to the ratio of actual fat versus not fat. But even then, these can vary slightly by brand and by batch. And then cooking can also alter how much fat remains in the dish. So again, like, this is not to demonize red meat. It's not to say remove it from your diet. I think there are a lot of benefits to having it in your diet. But I do see one of the biggest issues is that people will log more generically and out of convenience and simply pick steak or ground beef from a tracking database, and that can be wildly inaccurate. Now, when we look at like cooking methods, like, I love a good reverse sear, but I'll say if Jordan and I are cooking, ribeyes, that's something that I'm generally going to want to have the flexibility to prepare for satisfaction and palatability. And all that's to say that if I'm in a strict fat loss phase or if I'm in a phase where I really do want to see progress and I don't want that, dice roll of variability in calories. So for Thanksgiving this year, I mean, like, yeah, we were having a lot of high fat food, but specifically with the protein, I was like, hey, like, instead, let me get a filet. You go ahead and do ribeye. I'll have some of the ribeye, but like realistically, I want to have a good portion of red meat where I know generally the fat content's going to be lower. Now, some people are going to assume that just because you get it ground, that it's going to always yield the exact same macros on the label. But again, this is going to vary batch to batch. So in the case that you're like, hey, I only like eating red meat, like that's and frankly, there are a lot of, potential health risk of eating red meat in high volumes. So I mean, like, I would also be cognizant of that. If that's something that you're not like really attuned to how much you're eating and very consistent with the cooking method, then it could be something that inadvertently is ruining your diet, sabotaging your progress. And if you want better control over your calories, I would choose something that is a little bit leaner and a little bit easier to log accurately and consistently. All right, food number 5, salmon. Very similar argument to red meat. Wild, farmed, lean versus fatty cuts, you can see that depending on the part of the fish that you actually get, depending on the size of the fish, how fatty that fish exactly is, depending on the type of fish, whether it was wild, farmed, Atlantic, sockeye, king salmon, these can all have varying degrees of fat content, thus more calories. And even with the same type of salmon where the fillet is cut, you have to understand like closer to the belly versus the tail, that can alter the fat ratio as well. Now, on top of that, different cooking methods, baking, grilling, pan-searing, that can lead to variable water loss. So again, this is one that, and I guess I should say this about the red meat, I would weigh these foods, I would weigh them raw, and I would get a really good idea of, depending on the cooking method, if you're going to have it regularly and you're going to cook it the same way pretty much every single time, get a good idea of weighing it raw. What's the conversion? Like, what is the amount you are left with in that scenario, so that if you don't want to weigh it raw every time, or you're doing more of like a batch prep with your partner or your family, this could give a little leeway so that you're not having to weigh it raw every single time. But in a perfect world where it's not an inconvenience, I would just prepare it separately so that you can get that raw weight and that final weight and get a really good understanding of what you're left with, and hopefully reduce any variance and inaccuracies in that food reporting. Now, the other thing with salmon that I see a lot of people mess up is the actual logging, like in their data tracking app. I'll see people who eat salmon, and I am people in this case. I was actually in contest prep. This was in 21. Shane's like, he knew I was eating salmon. Like, I was doing macros at the time. He was fine with it, and I was seeing good progress, so it was whatever. But there was a point towards the end where I told him, like, I'm switching my fat source to salmon, and it was over the course of a couple weeks where, like, I wasn't necessarily seeing as much progress as I should have. Like, I was still in a massive deficit, but there was a big discrepancy in how he's tracking, and he finally uncovered it. He was like, hey, like, you're having salmon, like, how much are you having? And then he like kind of did the math. He's like, that's way over your calories. And it wasn't much over my calories. I think it was like 300, but it was still like that close to prep. Like, we definitely saw that impact my ability to stay in the deficit that we thought we were. And in this case, like, I looked at the log I was using, which prep brain, whatever, I thought I was using the same log I'd historically used, but in this one, the fat content, what I was logging every single day, was much lower, and the protein intake was much higher. So in my instance, and this has happened several times with food, so I mean, like, that's where, like, even for experienced trackers, I want you to be very humble with the fact that, like, you might need to go into your chronometer, into your MyFitnessPal, whatever it is, and take a second look at the log that you're using and just make sure that the macros actually add up. From here, we like looked and we found a different log, and we agreed, okay, like, this is a little more appropriate for the amount of fat. And I think at that point it was like, hey, let's just take this out, and that in itself is going to drive progress. And sure enough, once I adjusted that, my macros aligned better with the results we expected. Now, another issue with fish, with salmon, and I'm going to just like keep this under the umbrella of salmon, is that when we're talking about sushi, you have the sushi that you can get from the store. You have sushi that you can go to a restaurant and get. Restaurant sushi slices can be very inconsistent. And if you are very serious about macro tracking, I would expect and really just own that there's going to be an error of margin every single time. Now, if you buy sushi grade salmon and like you go to a fish market and like you have it yourself, again, there could be a variability in the amount of marbling that there is, or the amount of fat content, but you can then weigh it precisely. But that level of control is not very practical for a lot of people, and it's not something they typically want to do. But I will say, in the case where someone like, and I had this girl where like literally she's in prep and she's like, yeah, but like I get sushi because I don't cook a lot. And she's like, I just make sure to get like salmon nigiri. And I'm like, okay, cool. But like, are you taking into account that the rice could be cooked with sugar? Are you taking into account that the salmon is going to be cut differently pretty much every single time, even if it's by the same person preparing it? It's like, these are not going to be 100% accurate. And on top of that, like what she was logging, it didn't really account for any discrepancies. It was a very convenient log for what she needed to make fit her macros. So I would keep that in mind if you're going to be eating out regularly or eating sushi regularly, is that there can be hidden calories, which I guess I should have said this according to the rice section, but like that's one that oftentimes I see bite people in the ass. Number 6, nut butter. Now, this is one that personally, it's just typically a problem for me. It's not one that I like to have readily in my diet, and it's very similar to other types of foods. It's just like, it is very high calorie. It doesn't go very far. 100 calories for, 15, 16 grams in a lot of cases. And for me, like in an oatmeal or like cream of rice bowl, that just isn't very satisfying. But what I find really sneak up on people is it can be highly palatable because it's high fat. And a lot of people will run into the issue, especially individuals who are struggling with adherence. They'll just grab a spoonful, and it's not actually a spoonful. It's not actually one serving. It's not 16 grams. It is 2 or 3 spoonfuls. And that's in the case where you're just being very like, okay, I'm just going to have one. But a lot of people will eat it from the jar in repetition and be like, okay, well, it's just nut butter. It's not that big a deal. I know I went over, but like they don't realize to the degree that they went over. So that's where I wouldn't necessarily use like a measuring spoon. I wouldn't just like eyeball it. That's one very much specifically in the off season too. I would go out of your way, like always weigh that. Also like different densities too. If you're using more of like a natural butter and it has the oil that like floats and sinks or whatever, that could be something that over time, like you are getting higher degrees of density from the jar. And I don't necessarily mean like, hey, you need to modulate that. It's just something that I think a lot of people, they don't realize how easy it is to overeat. And some people, maybe they don't struggle with that at all. Some of you guys are probably like, yo, like you sound very ED with that. And I'll admit, yeah, like even non-sweetened nut butters, that's something that generally I'll say is like, if it's in the house, I have to be very present when I'm in the kitchen. Like I am not going to benefit from eating this and very quickly. I mean, it's like what we're talking about, 5 tablespoons, that is about 60 minutes of cardio on the stairs. That is not worth it. But that's something that people with issues around like emotionally eating and using food as a coping mechanism, they can very easily struggle with. So I would just be mindful and very honest about like your expectations. If it's something that you struggle with, and if it's something that's on your meal plan in like these weird amounts, like 5 grams or 8 grams, it's like, sure, but it's high calorie. You might be able to get more out of something else. It might be more satiating. And frankly, if it's going to tempt you and potentially cause you to go off track, it might not be something that's worth having even in these small spurts. Food number 7, and that is chocolate. And I know some of you are going to be like, hey, like I can't imagine having chocolate in my diet because like I'm trying to lose fat and chocolate is a very like snacky junk food. I work with a lot of people, and I've worked with a lot of people who have, treated chocolate as like, I need that daily win. I need that daily reward. But what you have to understand is that foods that are high in sugar and fat, they're hyper palatable. And research within obesity and neuroscience do suggest that the combination of both of these, it does tap into the reward pathways in the brain, often referred to as the bliss point. Now, if it's something that you're like, hey, I want to have this readily because I want to combat really this idea that chocolate is bad, I understand that. And I mean, like I came from a background feeling like the only way I could lose body fat was to eliminate all these foods I liked. And I think really the remodeling from having foods that intentionally make your diet harder versus respecting the fact that you can have these foods, but it might not be worth it. I think that is the more logical approach and the more sustainable approach. And if you were putting foods into your diet just for the fact of like, oh, like I want to stick it to my coach or stick it to the group of people that, are super restrictive and like, eat very bland diets, it's like, you also have to understand, like, you don't get points for suffering, and like you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Like you can like these foods, and you can like these foods in amounts that are very, let's just say objectively gluttonous. But realistically, if having these foods in your diet is eating away at parts of your budget that can be better spent, I see it more as like adolescent than actually like making a statement and benefiting you. And I know like some people are probably like, yo, that's like way left field. Like that goes into more of like the psychosocial around food behaviors. But trust me, like I see a lot of people who they struggle with adherence, they struggle with feeling full, yet they are afraid to remove chocolate from their pancakes in the morning or from their granola bowl at night. And it's like, if you have the calories to do it, okay, that's one thing, but you also have to ask, like, why are you using this as a crutch? Like, why is this something that you're afraid to remove from your diet? And does it need to be in your diet every single day? Like, how is this yielding in terms of, mental satisfaction and dietary fatigue? Is there a chance that this in itself is actually making those those spikes in dietary fatigue even greater, because now you have that surge of, desire that you want to have chocolate on a daily basis. And when you feel like you don't have it, you then have the tendency to want to have more and more and more. Another client I worked with, she was, I would say, exposed to a high degree of like mini or fun sized portions at her job. And she, at first when she started the diet, she's like, it's okay, I'm just going to have one or two. But what she found is then it became very much a crutch, and it became something that she felt like she was entitled to and deserved. And it eventually dug her into this hole where, even though she's like, okay, I am not seeing quite the progress that I want, I'm definitely hungrier going into the later half of the day after I've had these chocolates, she wasn't even really feeling satisfied for them, but it just became so routine that when I asked her, I'm like, hey, like, is it possible that we could like remove this and put something else in place that keeps you feeling fuller, that also is, it can be sweet, but is going to offer more performance benefits and satiation benefits? Can we do that? She's like, yeah, it feels like a little bit of a burden to remove this from my diet at this point, because I'm so much into the routine of like having this after lunch around like 1 or 2 p.m. And I think for some people, they can very much treat it as that, as a treat. But realistically, in the case where it's like you are exposed to these things at a high frequency, I wouldn't necessarily give in each time, because you're almost always going to find a justification for having that treat. All right, food number 8, oat milk, full fat milk, or really just like any milk that is going to be calorically dense. And this can kind of apply to really any liquid calories, but you'll see where I'm going with this. Now, many people, they will assume that having coffee is calorie free. They'll just be like, it's my caffeine, it's my deal breaker, it's my non-negotiable. But for a lot of people, drinking coffee, I mean, like, yes, in the fitness community, you have more people that just drink black coffee, but there still are a lot of people that really rely on the flavoring, using a full fat milk, using a milk alternative. And these things can really add up depending on how much you're using. Now, oat milk, coconut milk, full-fat dairy milk, they can contribute another 100 to 200 calories depending on the size of coffee you're getting, depending on how much you're using. And if you enjoy multiple coffees a day that have high degree of milk contents, you can easily rack up 200 to 500 calories depending on the size that you're getting. So let's say you're on a 500 calorie deficit. So, you are, hoping to lose 1 pound a week. If you unknowingly add, let's say 250 calories from coffee and, I wouldn't necessarily say in excess, but, you just perceive it as like, well, this is my routine. This is my slush fund of things that like, I don't want to change. You might find that this in itself not only doesn't help in terms of satiation and satisfaction, but if you're not tracking these things, if you're not doing like a very good inventory of how much is being used, this can very easily take you out of a deficit. Now, even if you're meticulously tracking the solids, you might ignore that the liquids in your flat white or your latte over time, like thinking, oh, it's just a splash. It's like, yeah, but they do add up. And depending on the frequency in which you have these beverages, I mean, like, this isn't something that can stay negligible forever. Now, when you are preparing a drink at home, you're preparing, a coffee, whatever, you have the ability, hopefully, to weigh. And I'll say, like, being someone who, I would say only in really the last year have I, refined my palate specifically with coffee, that now I rely less on like milk and sweeteners. Right now I'm only using like 40 mLs like within my coffee in the morning. Like I do pour over, I genuinely enjoy the flavor profiles and the notes, but within the course of the last 5 years, like I was using, 150, 200 mLs of oat milk, which like realistically, it's like, yeah, if you're tracking that, it's not a small amount, but then you have to think like I would go work at like coffee shops, or I'd go work throughout the day and I would grab a latte, I would grab a flat white. And even if, in the case I'm like, oh, I need the extra coffee, I would still get like, maybe not the small size, the medium size. And I would still want, a high degree of that milk volume in the drink itself. So it's like looking back, I'm like, yeah, realistically, I can see where I was eating up so much of my budget just through liquid calories, which like, oat milk is fucking delicious. Like, it's great. But realistically, it's not something that is going to take you very far in terms of, stretching your caloric budget. And I think it's something you kind of have to ask yourself, like, would you rather spend 200 calories or 300 calories on coffee throughout the day or a more filling food? And if you truly love like a milky coffee or a calorically dense coffee, like that's valid, but understand the trade-off or really the cost, the opportunity cost of having that drink every day. This is something that like I would recommend if you're very routine driven and you want to have that high calorie coffee, let's say first thing in the morning. That might be something that, you make at home if you can, or if you have a shop that you're like, I always go here every single morning. Okay, cool. But if you're going to be hitting that same shop or having multiple coffees a day, maybe set limits around like, okay, well, like my first one, I'm going to have higher calorie, but then my second one, maybe I'm going to get a cold brew. Maybe I'm going to bring that home and put my own creamer in it or my own milk in it, whatever it might be. But creamers are also, a one that can easily become like out of control. So it's not something I don't want to like step on your toes and like, oh, like you shouldn't have, but there is a very objective cost of having these things. And, it really irks me for the people that are like, like I have these things 2 to 3 times a day, like not the small size, medium or large, yet they don't track it. They're just like, nope, not going to track it. Like that's going to be the amount that I just do regardless of what I'm eating. I think that's a really quick way to lead you to a very frustrated state. And honestly, just like when it comes to liquid calories, they can very like quite literally undo your daily deficit, especially if you're blissfully ignorant to the damage that they're doing. And food number 9, granola. Often marketed as healthy, it is touted as very like wholesome, and you'll see a lot of brands, they will like really peddle like, oh, this has whole grains and nuts and seeds, and it's locally sourced and it has all these natural sugars. But you have to understand that like granola, it's fucking delicious. It's so good. But if you're not measuring carefully, it can easily become something that turns your 300 calorie breakfast into a 450 or 500 calorie breakfast. And if you're just kind of going throughout your day, like snacking on it, which I'm self-admitting, like it's not something I like having in the house because it's delicious and the texture is fantastic. But even a small serving, like to me, it's like 16 grams, like for like about 100 calories, that's just not going to do it for me. And it's definitely not going to keep me full. And it's going to make me then want more of it. So I kind of see it as something that like, yeah, even in the case where it has health benefits because of the content of the granola, what is this doing to you psychologically? How is this making you feel? What kind of foods is this making you want later in the day? And I already talked about like my client who and good on her. Like she was like, hey, I want a meal plan that I really enjoy. And we've worked together for a long time. So she's like, I want to take like ownership of my meals. So I encouraged her. I'm like, here are the macros. I want you to try to put together a meal plan in your tracking app based on what you enjoy. And then I'll give you feedback. I'll give you critiques and I'll kind of point you in the right direction. So like you understand how to do this so that you develop that skill. Now in her meal plan, originally she had like 25 grams of granola. I'm like, girl, like this isn't going to go very far. And also like this is eating up all of your fat content. So all your other meals are very like disjointed in terms of macronutrient composition. And frankly, I know with her, I'm like, hey, like we need to really develop this skill, which I think is going to take eating highly satiating foods because hunger is something she's struggling with. And I mean, really, this is easy math. It's like in the case where you're eating, 1,400 calories and 180, 200 calories are coming from granola, like that's a pretty high percentage of your food that's coming from something that's still very much a treat. Like it is masqueraded as a health food, but I mean, realistically, same issue as chocolate. It has a lot of sugar, it has a lot of fat, and yes, it can have benefits from those fat sources, but there are healthier fat sources that are not going to give you those high sugar cravings that personally I think get people into a lot of trouble. Guys, these foods that we covered today, they're all potentially calorically dense or in some cases easy to mismeasure. They're not bad, but they can definitely make your fat loss that much harder, and they can really fuck with the perception that like you're in a diet and you're working hard and you're putting forth effort, yet you feel like you're not seeing the results that you should be seeing at this point. The takeaways: invest in a very simple food scale and practice measuring these portions, because knowledge is going to give you control and peace of mind. And I think it's very paramount, if we're talking about someone who's going to eat out regularly, to understand like, what does 4 ounces of chicken breast look and taste like, so that when you go out to eat, even if it's marketed as chicken, you don't really know the cut, you can identify, okay, well, that actually is like closer to 6 ounces. And realistically, even if it's chicken breast or chicken tenderloins, it was definitely cooked in oil, because it tastes way better than what I cook at home when I just spray or use very, very light coating. Now, when we're talking about satiation and adherence, I mean, focus on filling up on these high volume foods, high satiating foods. I have a whole video on leptin, ghrelin, and the satiety index, but you can add in foods that you enjoy in, isolation, but I wouldn't make it something that you use as a crutch to just get through your day. Just because frankly, like, don't let food control you. Like, don't let it be something that you feel like you're held hostage by. And if there's a food that you're like, it's in my diet, but it gives me anxiety because I always want to eat more than I actually have prescribed or have, written out. It's like, that's a good opportunity to be like, fuck this food. Like, I'm going to have something that doesn't, create this internal turmoil every time I try to follow my meal plan. So as we go through these, rice, you need to understand, like, the carb content can shift if you cook it differently, and it's very easy to overeat. It's not highly satiating. Potatoes, those can be one that you mess up the carb content just depending on how you cook it. Seeds, flax, chia, tiny but very calorically dense. Red meat, salmon, both of these have high variability in what is actually presented to you, what you consume versus what you log. Nut butter, chocolate, granola, these are all ones that can be highly palatable, making you want more of them. And oat milk, that can be something that just doesn't get you very far. And I don't know why I'm so hung up on oat milk, because it's delicious and I love it. But this goes for all liquid calories, all full fat milk alternatives, whatever it might be, anything that, is kind of sneaking its way into your diet. And realistically, like, I've had people come to me where they're like, I'm just not seeing the results that I want. And I've seen every single one of these things trip them up in terms of their food reporting. And I think truly, if you can be honest with your food reporting, I think you're going to see a lot better, a lot more, a lot faster progress. And that's ultimately what I want to help you do. So if you enjoyed this video, definitely let me know if there are foods that I missed, or you're like, hey, like, this is a great alternative to any of the 9 foods. Definitely drop that in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, I will see you in the next one.